My son sold my wedding ring for a holiday, but he had no idea what I'd do next. Even now, as I let those words leave my lips, I can feel the bitterness rising in my chest like fire. That wedding ring was not just a piece of gold. It was the last living connection to the only woman I ever loved, my wife, the one who stood beside me through decades of sacrifice, hardship, and triumph. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. When she passed away, that ring became a symbol of everything we had built together, a silent witness to the vows we kept until death parted us. To lose it would have been unbearable, but to know it was sold by my own flesh and blood, my son, for nothing more than a fleeting holiday, that was a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. I still remember the moment I discovered the truth. The air in the house felt heavy, almost suffocating, and every tick of the clock on the wall echoed like a countdown to something breaking inside me. My hands trembled as I searched the little wooden box where I kept the ring, the box my wife once carved her initials into with a pocket knife on our 15th anniversary. Empty, gone. For a moment I thought I was losing my mind, that maybe I had misplaced it somewhere else. But deep down, in the cold quiet of my gut, I knew the house didn't feel like home that evening. It felt like a stranger's place, invaded and hollow, as though every shadow whispered that something sacred had been defiled. That ring had seen me through the lean years when I worked double shifts to keep food on the table. It had gleamed on my wife's hand when she held our newborn son, the very same son who now viewed it as nothing more than currency. The irony was so bitter, it nearly made me choke. I remember sitting in my armchair, staring at the wall, my mind racing between disbelief and fury. How could he? After everything I had done, after every sacrifice, after raising him single-handedly once his mother passed, how could my son strip away the last piece of her memory for sand, cocktails, and the shallow thrill of palm trees swaying on some foreign shore? My hand tightened around the armrest of the chair until my knuckles went white. Anger, grief, betrayal, it all swirled inside me until I could barely breathe. A cruel question echoed over and over in my head. Was this what my life had amounted to? Was I nothing more than a wallet, a resource to be drained until nothing remained, not even my own heart? And then, almost as quickly as the pain had stabbed into me, something else began to grow. It started as a spark, a tiny ember of cold resolve, flickering in the ashes of my grief. He thought he had won. He thought I was blind, powerless, too old to fight back. But he didn't know me. Not truly. He had no idea what I still carried within me, the strength, the cunning, the will to protect what mattered, even if I had been underestimated all my life. My son may have sold my wedding ring for a holiday, but he had no idea what I'd do next. That was just the beginning. I can still feel the weight of that moment as though it happened yesterday. The church was small, almost modest, with sunlight streaming in through stained glass windows that painted our faces with colors of ruby and sapphire. My wife stood before me, her hands trembling not from fear but from the immensity of what we were about to promise each other. She was radiant in a way words cannot capture, her eyes glowing with a certainty that made me believe we could survive anything as long as we were together. And then she slid the ring onto my finger. That simple band, unadorned, without diamonds or ornaments, carried more meaning than any jewel ever could. It was not about wealth, it was about permanence. It was a promise carved into gold that she and I were bound not only in love, but in sacrifice. That ring symbolized every dream we whispered in the dark, every hardship we knew we would face, and every triumph we hoped one day to celebrate. As her fingers lingered on mine, I remember the softness of her touch, the way her smile trembled as she fought back tears of joy. In that instant, the world around us disappeared. The chatter of guests, the rustle of fabric, even the steady voice of the priest faded away. There was only her and me and the bond sealed by that ring. We were young, perhaps naive, but we carried within us the courage to build a life from nothing. That courage was woven into the very metal of the ring itself. Over the years, it witnessed everything. When we sat together at the kitchen table with nothing but rice and broth to eat, the ring reminded us that our hunger was temporary, but our love was eternal. When I worked myself to the bone at 2 jobs, my hands calloused and raw, the ring glinted faintly under the fluorescent lights, a reminder that every drop of sweat was worth it because I had someone waiting for me at home. When our son was born, my wife held him in her arms, and as she reached for my hand, the ring brushed against the soft skin of his tiny fingers. It was as if our love had extended itself into flesh and blood, a living testament to what we had built. I can still see her laughter during the hard times, how she would place her hand on mine, the ring pressing warmly into my skin, grounding me when I felt I could no longer carry the weight of our burdens. It wasn't just a band of gold, it was a silent witness, a guardian of our vows. The ring was there when we buried our parents, when we moved into our first home, when we celebrated 20 years together with nothing more than a candlelit dinner at the kitchen table. It was there through arguments and reconciliations, through silence and song, through sickness and health. And finally, it was there when I held her frail hand as she lay in the hospital bed, the light in her eyes dimming but her love for me burning until the very end. I can still hear her whisper, "Don't let go of us." And when she was gone, I had only the ring to hold on to. It became more than gold. It became memory made solid, a vessel of love and sacrifice that nothing and no one had the right to touch. That is why the loss struck so deep. It wasn't just theft. It wasn't just greed. It was desecration. My son had not only taken an object, he had violated the one thing that tied me to her, to us, to everything we had built. When I remember her slipping that ring onto my finger for the first time, I know with certainty what he stole was not just metal. He stole the sacred symbol of a lifetime, and for that, he will face what he has never imagined. From the moment my son was born, my life stopped being about me and became entirely about him. I still remember pacing the floor of that small hospital room, my heart racing with both fear and pride as I looked down at the fragile life in my arms. I whispered promises to him that day, promises I would keep for the next decades of my life. I promised I would never let him go hungry, never let him sleep without a roof over his head, and never let him feel abandoned. And for years, I held true to every single word. Life was never easy. I worked jobs that bent my back and tore at my hands. While others my age were building careers in offices, I was pouring concrete, hauling steel, and taking night shifts just to keep enough food on the table. My wife used to massage my shoulders at night, her soft hands soothing the aches that work had etched into my bones. She would tell me that one day our sacrifices would give our son the kind of life we never had, and I believed her. That belief carried me through the exhaustion, the missed meals, the hours spent away from home. When he was a boy, I gave him everything I could. I skipped buying myself new shoes so he could have the best school supplies. I worked overtime so he could go on school trips. When he outgrew his clothes faster than I could afford them, I mended holes and stitched tears late at night, just to make them last a little longer. My son never went without. He had warm meals, clean clothes, and the safety of a home, even if it meant I went without luxuries or sometimes even without rest. When he was older, I poured my savings into his education. Every paycheck was stretched to its breaking point, but I told myself it would be worth it, that I was building a future for him. I went without vacations, without hobbies, without even simple pleasures, so that he could have the opportunities I had only dreamed of. And when his mother passed away, I shielded him from the worst of it. Even in my grief, even as my world fell apart, I made sure his remained intact. I cooked, I cleaned, I worked, I parented alone, all while carrying the weight of my own heartbreak. I gave him the house we lived in, telling him that one day it would all be his. I believed that showing him security would teach him gratitude. But gratitude never came. Instead, entitlement took root. The more I gave, the more he expected. He grew accustomed to the idea that everything in his life would be handed to him, that sacrifices were invisible, that hard work was optional. He never saw the nights I came home too tired to eat. He never noticed the years I spent denying myself or the calluses that never left my hands. And yet, I never stopped giving. Even when he was grown, I let him live under my roof when he struggled. I paid bills when he couldn't. I helped him pay down debts, believing that each time would be the last. I told myself he just needed a little more time to mature, that he would one day understand the depth of the love behind all my sacrifices. But he never did. Instead, his demands grew sharper, his words more dismissive, his tone more entitled. Still, I stayed silent. I thought a father's role was to endure, to protect, to give until there was nothing left to give. My son had become blind to the sacrifices that raised him, blind to the cost of the life he enjoyed, blind to the fact that every brick of the house he lived in was laid with my blood, sweat, and tears. And maybe that blindness is what allowed him to do what he did. Maybe that is why, in his arrogance, he could look at the ring on my wife's hand, the ring that had survived every hardship, every sacrifice, every moment of our shared life, and see it not as sacred, but as expendable. Maybe he believed that because I had given him everything else, I would give that too. But he was wrong. For the first time in his life, he was about to learn that my sacrifices had limits, and that betraying me meant facing consequences he never thought I had the strength to deliver. It started with little requests, the kind any parent would recognize. A small loan here, a bit of help with rent there. At first I told myself it was normal, that everyone stumbles on their way to building a life, that my role as his father was to catch him when he fell. But as the years passed, those small requests grew into demands, and those demands hardened into expectations. It wasn't just help he wanted anymore, it was a lifestyle he felt he was owed. I remember one particular evening when he sat across from me at the dinner table, his plate untouched, his arms crossed, and that look on his face that I had grown to dread. It wasn't the look of a man asking for help. It was the look of a man issuing an ultimatum. He sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair, his tone sharp and dismissive as he said, "Dad, you know I could really use some extra cash. Just a couple thousand this time. I'll pay you back." I stared at him, my fork frozen halfway to my mouth. A couple thousand? Just like that, as if money were leaves to be plucked from the trees in our backyard, as if my decades of sacrifice meant nothing, as if I had some secret vault hidden away, overflowing with wealth. I told him gently, that I didn't have that kind of money to spare, that things were tight, that he needed to start managing his own responsibilities. He scoffed, actually scoffed, as though my words were beneath him. "Come on, Dad. You've always figured it out before. Don't act like you can't help me now. You just don't want to." That cut deeper than he could ever understand. He didn't see the years I had worked myself nearly to death to make sure he never went hungry. He didn't remember the bills I had quietly paid behind his back to keep his lights on. He didn't recall the nights I went without so he could have. In his mind, I wasn't a man who had earned rest. I was a resource, an endless reservoir he could draw from whenever he pleased. And when I didn't comply quickly enough, the arrogance became sharper. His voice grew colder. "You don't get it, do you? I need this. I can't just sit around like you did. I want to live. I want experiences. You're so stuck in your ways, hoarding what little you have, when you could actually be helping me make something of myself." Hoarding. That was the word he used, as if the money I had managed to scrape together after a lifetime of work wasn't for my survival, my security in old age, but some selfish stash I was clinging to for no reason. I sat there in silence, my heart aching, my anger simmering beneath the surface. I wanted to remind him that every brick of this house had been laid with sweat he never shed, that every dollar I saved had been carved from the hours of my life I would never get back. But he wouldn't have listened. Entitlement had already closed his ears. The requests became constant. Each week there was some new story, some new reason, a car payment he was behind on, a new gadget he needed to keep up appearances, a vacation he claimed would change his perspective on life. Always dressed up as necessity, but beneath the words was the same core truth. He believed he was owed, and if I resisted, he would grow cruel. His words sharpened into blades. "You don't want me to succeed, do you? You just want me to struggle like you did. You've never understood ambition. You're just jealous that I want more for myself than you ever had." Jealous. Imagine that. A father who spent his whole life breaking his back so his son wouldn't have to, accused of envy because he wouldn't bankroll his son's arrogance. I bit my tongue. I swallowed my pride, but every word sank deep into me like a thorn. Looking back now, I realized that this entitlement had been growing for years, festering quietly beneath the surface, and I had allowed it to grow by giving too much, forgiving too much, excusing too much. And yet, nothing prepared me for what came next. His arrogance, his dismissiveness, his endless pressure for money, they were all leading to a betrayal I never thought my own blood could commit. The day he set his eyes on the wedding ring was the day his entitlement crossed a line from which there would be no return. It was a quiet morning, the kind I used to treasure. The sun filtered in through the curtains, dust motes swirling lazily in the light, and for a brief moment I felt a rare sense of calm. My routine was simple. I made tea, I sat at the table, and sometimes I let myself drift into memories. That morning, though, something nudged me toward the bedroom, toward the small wooden box that I always kept on the dresser. It was a ritual of sorts. Every few days, I would open it just to look at the ring, to hold it in my hand and feel connected to her again. I lifted the lid with the same careful reverence I always did. But when my eyes fell on the empty velvet cushion inside, my breath caught in my throat. At first, I thought I was mistaken. Perhaps I had placed it somewhere else. Perhaps I had moved it absent-mindedly. I searched the surface of the dresser, the drawer beneath it, even the pockets of the coat I had worn the day before. Nothing. My chest tightened as though an iron band had wrapped around it. My fingers shook as I tore through the room, pulling out boxes, rifling through papers, searching in every corner I could think of. The ring was gone, just gone. A hollow ache spread through me, radiating outward until it felt like my whole body was being pulled apart from the inside. It was as though someone had reached into my chest and torn out a piece of my heart. That ring wasn't just gold. It wasn't just jewelry. It was her. It was us. It was the life we had built together. All the laughter, all the tears, all the nights spent holding each other when the world outside felt too heavy to bear. Losing it felt like losing her all over again. My knees buckled and I sank onto the edge of the bed, my head in my hands, gasping as the weight of the loss pressed down on me. I tried to calm myself, tried to reason with my thoughts. Maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe it had fallen behind the dresser. Maybe anything other than the truth that was clawing at the back of my mind. But deep down, even in those frantic moments, I knew things had been disappearing slowly, quietly, over the past months. Small sums of money missing, items moved, explanations that didn't quite make sense, and now this. The most sacred thing of all. My stomach turned violently as the possibility I didn't want to face took shape. Could he have done it? Could my own son, the boy I raised, the boy I sacrificed everything for, truly have taken it? The thought alone was unbearable, and yet it fit too perfectly with the pattern I had tried so hard to ignore. His endless demands, his arrogance, his cold dismissal of my refusals, it all led here. I staggered to my feet, the room spinning around me. I pressed my palms to the dresser as though the wood itself could steady me, but nothing could soothe the storm inside. My breathing grew shallow, every inhale sharp and painful, every exhale laced with disbelief. The silence of the house seemed to mock me, heavy and oppressive, amplifying the emptiness inside that little wooden box. I walked through the house aimlessly, my eyes scanning the familiar walls, the furniture, the photographs. Everything felt tainted now. Every memory echoed with betrayal. The home I had built with my own two hands, the home that once sheltered laughter and love, now felt hollow, invaded. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. I sat in the living room, staring at nothing, my mind replaying the years of sacrifice, the years of love, all reduced to dust because the one person who should have protected that ring as much as I did had stripped it away. My hands trembled as I clasped them together, my knuckles whitening. The physical pain of the loss was unbearable. It wasn't just in my chest, it was in my bones, in my blood, in every breath I drew. That morning, I felt like the ground beneath me had crumbled. The ring was gone, and with it, the last anchor to the woman I loved. My son had crossed a line from which there would be no return. I didn't yet know what I would do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not the end of the story. The days after I discovered the empty box were a blur of restless nights and hollow mornings. I moved through the house like a ghost, my body present but my soul heavy, dragging itself behind me. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, not to assume the worst, but suspicion gnawed at me, burrowing deeper with every hour. I had tried to silence it, but the silence only made the doubts louder. And then, one evening, the truth I dreaded most revealed itself in the cruelest way imaginable. I was in the kitchen, the house dim, except for the faint glow from the living room. I had gone to refill my tea when I heard voices drifting through the half-open doorway. My son and his wife were sitting on the couch, their laughter sharp, their words laced with arrogance. At first, I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but something in their tone stopped me cold. I stayed in the shadows, my hand tightening around the handle of the teapot as their conversation unfolded. "Can you believe it?" my son said, his voice dripping with pride. "The old man never even noticed. That stupid ring was just sitting there, gathering dust. I got a good price for it, too. Enough to cover the flights and the hotel. First class, no less. We're going to live like royalty for once." His wife laughed, a light, careless laugh that stabbed into me like a knife. "It's about time. Honestly, who clings to a piece of metal like that anyway? He probably stares at it like it's some kind of treasure. It's pathetic." I felt my knees weaken, and I steadied myself against the wall, every muscle in my body trembling. The words rang in my ears, louder than any shout could have been. They weren't just talking about a ring. They were mocking me, mocking the love I had built my life on, mocking the memory of my wife. My son continued, his tone more venomous with each word. "He's so sentimental it's laughable. Always talking about Mom like she was some kind of saint. That ring was the only thing he had left of her, and now it's mine. Well, mine to sell. He won't say a word, he never does. He's too weak to confront me. Too weak." That phrase lodged itself deep inside me, searing like fire. My son, my own flesh and blood, saw me not as a father, not as a man who had given him everything, but as a weak old fool too broken to defend what mattered. I couldn't breathe. My chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, the room spinning as though the walls themselves were collapsing around me. I pressed a hand against my heart, trying to contain the storm that threatened to tear it apart. It was one thing to lose the ring. It was another to know that the theft came not from desperation, not from need, but from arrogance and contempt. Their laughter filled the air again, cruel and careless, while I stood in the shadows, invisible in my own home. I wanted to step out, to shout, to confront them then and there, but I didn't. Instead, I turned back into the darkness of the kitchen, silent, trembling, my mind a storm of grief and rage. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, my hands gripping the mattress so tightly the fabric tore beneath my fingers. My son's words echoed endlessly in my head. "He's too weak to confront me." Over and over like a cruel chorus, mocking me, daring me to prove him wrong. Tears came, hot and unrelenting, sliding down my face as I buried my head in my hands. The grief of losing her once again mixed with the burning betrayal of realizing what my son truly thought of me. For decades, I had been his foundation, his protector, his provider, and now I was nothing more than an obstacle to his greed, a man to be ridiculed, exploited, and dismissed. That night, something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, raw and unbearable, but beneath it, another feeling began to grow. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't despair. It was something colder, sharper. It was resolve. My son thought he had won. He thought I was powerless. But he was about to learn that a father's silence is not always weakness. Sometimes it is the calm before the storm. That night, after hearing his words, I closed the door to my bedroom and locked it as though shutting out the rest of the world. My legs carried me only as far as the edge of the bed before they gave out beneath me, and I sat there in silence, staring at the floor as if the answers to my pain might be carved into the grain of the wood. The house was quiet, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, suffocating you with its weight. For the first time in years, I wept without restraint. My shoulders shook, my breath came in jagged gasps, and the sound that escaped me was not the cry of a strong man, but the broken sob of someone who had lost everything twice. Once when my wife died, And again when my son betrayed me, tears slid down my cheeks, hot and bitter, soaking into my hands as I buried my face in them. I tried to stop, but the pain was too much, a flood that could no longer be contained. I had always believed that my sacrifices mattered, that the love and labor I poured into my son had built something solid. But in that moment, it all seemed worthless. What had my years of toil meant if he could throw away the most sacred symbol of my marriage for a holiday, a week of pleasure that would be forgotten as quickly as it came? My heart ached not only from grief but from humiliation. It wasn't just that he had taken the ring, it was that he had laughed about it, belittled me, called me weak. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. This was my child, the boy I had held in my arms the night he was born, the boy I had promised to protect, the boy I had poured my entire life into raising. And now he had repaid me with contempt. I had endured loneliness, exhaustion, and sacrifice for him, and in return, he had stripped me of the last piece of the woman I loved. I could feel the shame creeping into me, twisting itself around my grief. I asked myself over and over, had I been a fool all along? Had I raised a son who never valued me, who never saw me as more than a source of money and shelter? My hands trembled as I pressed them against my face, trying to hide from the thoughts tearing me apart. I wanted to scream, to tear at the walls, to demand answers from a world that seemed determined to break me. But all that came out were hoarse sobs, each one heavier than the last. I rocked back and forth on the bed, the way a grieving man does when there is no comfort to be found. Memories came flooding back, his first steps, his first words, the nights I stayed awake at his bedside when he was sick, the joy on his face when I surprised him with the toy he wanted so badly. Each memory pierced me like a blade, because now I saw them for what they were, seeds I had planted in soil that had never learned gratitude. My love had grown into entitlement, my sacrifices had grown into demands, and my silence, my endless forgiveness, had grown into contempt. The humiliation was unbearable. To know that he and his wife sat only a room away, laughing at me, mocking the very love that had built their lives, made me feel smaller than I had ever felt before. I curled inward, clutching my chest, feeling as though the grief might tear me apart. I whispered her name, my wife's name, into the darkness, begging for strength, for guidance, for anything that could lift me out of the pit I had fallen into. The hours stretched on, each one a torment. The tears slowed eventually, but the ache in my chest remained, deep and unrelenting. I stared at the ceiling, hollow, my eyes burning from exhaustion. I felt like a man undone, stripped of dignity, stripped of love, stripped of everything that had ever given my life meaning. In those hours of collapse, I believed I had nothing left. But beneath the grief, beneath the humiliation, something stirred. It was faint then, almost invisible, but it was there, a flicker of cold anger, a seed of resolve. My son thought I was broken, humiliated beyond repair. But what he didn't know was that the very pain he had caused would one day forge me into something stronger than he could ever imagine. The tears eventually dried, though the sting of them lingered on my face like salt etched into skin. I sat in the same spot for hours, motionless, drained of strength, yet unable to close my eyes. My grief had hollowed me out, but in that emptiness, something else began to take root. At first it was nothing more than a whisper, a quiet thought pushing through the wreckage of my heartbreak. But as the minutes passed, that whisper grew sharper, steadier, until it was no longer grief that filled me, but resolve. I replayed his words in my mind, too weak to confront him, pathetic for clinging to a ring, sentimental, foolish, blind. I thought of his laughter as he described how easily he had turned the symbol of my marriage into a ticket for a holiday, a week of leisure bought at the cost of a lifetime of love. He had placed a cheap value on something priceless, and in doing so, revealed exactly who he had become. My son no longer saw me as a father. He saw me as an obstacle, as a wallet, as a fool. But if he believed I would sit in silence forever, then he had made a grave mistake. I had been silent all his life. I had endured his arrogance, forgiven his selfishness, excused his entitlement. I had allowed him to walk over me because I thought that was what fathers did endure so their children could thrive. But the moment he sold that ring, he crossed a line from which there was no return. A lifetime of meaning had been reduced to a week in the sun, and he thought I would swallow that indignity. No, he was wrong. If that was how he valued the love that built his world, then he would soon face the cost. The house was dark, the silence thick, but I sat there with my hands clasped tightly together, staring into the shadows. I thought of my wife, her voice, her laughter, her quiet strength. She would never have allowed this. She would never have let her memory be desecrated by greed. And though she was gone, her spirit still lived in me, demanding justice. I whispered to her, as though she was still beside me. He thinks I am weak. He thinks I will do nothing. But I won't let this stand. I promise you, I will not let him mock what we built. I will not let him spit on your memory. The words hung in the air, and as they left my mouth, I felt the weight of them settle into my bones. This was no longer grief. This was resolve. Cold, deliberate, unyielding resolve. I thought of all the years I had bent beneath the weight of responsibility, all the sacrifices I had made without complaint. I had carried everyone else's burdens, and in return, I had been taken for granted. But now, for the first time in my life, I would not bend. I would stand tall, even if it meant standing alone. Images of what needed to be done began to form in my mind. I would not lash out blindly. I would not shout or rage like a fool. No, I would be patient. I would be methodical. I would make sure that when he realized the cost of his betrayal, it would be too late for him to undo it. He thought he knew me. He thought I was predictable, soft, incapable of striking back, but he had never seen the part of me forged by hardship, by loss, by years of enduring silently. He had mistaken my patience for weakness. That mistake would be his downfall. I rose from the bed at last, my legs stiff, but my spine straight. I walked to the mirror and stared at the reflection of an old man, tired and worn, but in my eyes there was something new. Not defeat, not despair, but fire. A fire that had been buried beneath years of silence, now burning bright and steady. My son thought the ring was gone forever. But he would learn soon enough that some things cannot be erased so easily. He had taken what was sacred and turned it into currency for pleasure. Now it was my turn to take something from him, not with violence, but with precision. He valued leisure over legacy, greed over love, arrogance over respect, and so he would pay. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty my days of silent suffering were over. My resolve was quiet, but it was unshakable. He would never see it coming, and when he did, it would be too late. The morning after my resolve hardened, I rose with a different weight in my chest. It was not the crushing grief of the night before, but the cold determination of a man with a purpose. I moved through the motions of breakfast, making tea, setting down the cup, but my mind was elsewhere. I knew what I had to do. If my son thought he could sell away the most sacred piece of my life without consequence, then he had underestimated me more than ever. The first step was clear. I had to find the ring. I dressed simply. An old jacket, sturdy shoes, nothing to draw attention. The world saw me as a tired old man, and I would let them. It gave me the advantage of invisibility. People rarely notice the quiet ones, and that suited me fine. As I stepped out of the house, the cool morning air struck my face, sharp and bracing, as if the world itself was reminding me to stay awake, to stay alert. My first stop was a small pawn shop on the edge of town, the kind of place where desperation trades with opportunism. The bell above the door jingled faintly as I entered, the air thick with the scent of dust and tarnished metal. Glass cases lined the walls, filled with trinkets, watches, and forgotten heirlooms. I scanned each one carefully, my heart pounding, though I tried to keep my face unreadable. The man behind the counter looked up briefly, then back down at his newspaper, uninterested in me. "Can I help you?" he muttered eventually, not lifting his eyes. I cleared my throat. "I'm looking for a ring. Gold, plain band. It has initials inside, carved many years ago." His eyes flicked up at me, sharp now. "We get a lot of rings through here. Hard to keep track." I nodded, pretending to accept his indifference, but I let my gaze linger on the cases a little longer. Nothing. The ache in my chest deepened, but I forced myself to thank him and leave. This was only the beginning. The next shop was brighter, more organized, with velvet trays of jewelry laid out like treasures in neat rows. I spoke to the woman behind the counter, describing the ring as carefully as I could. She listened politely but shook her head. "I'm sorry. We haven't had anything like that recently. But check the shops near the main road. A lot of items get moved around quickly." So I did. One by one, I made my way through the city, slipping into shops with flickering neon signs, shops tucked between abandoned buildings, even the sleek jewelers with their polished glass displays and cold smiles. At each place, I repeated the same words: a ring, plain gold band, initials inside. At each place, I felt the same mixture of hope and despair. Some shrugged me off. Some said no before I even finished my description. A few promised to keep an eye out, though I could see in their eyes they had already forgotten me. But I didn't give up. I couldn't. Every step I took, every question I asked, I carried her with me. I saw her face the day she slipped that ring onto my finger, her eyes filled with love. I heard her laughter, her voice, the promise we made to one another. That memory pushed me forward, past the exhaustion, past the doubt. By late afternoon, my legs ached and my throat was raw from repeating the same description, but I pressed on. I stopped at another shop, smaller than the rest, with a faded sign that barely hung on its hinges. Inside, the air was stale, the counters crowded with mismatched items. The man behind the counter eyed me warily. I described the ring once more, my voice steady despite the fatigue. For a moment, he said nothing, just stared at me with a look I couldn't quite read. Then he shrugged. Rings come and go, hard to remember every one. But I caught it, the flicker in his eyes, the hesitation. Something inside me tightened. He knew more than he was saying. I didn't press him then, not yet. I simply nodded, thanked him, and left. But as I stepped back into the evening air, I knew I was getting closer. The search was far from over, but I would not stop until I had the ring back in my hands. This was no longer just about possession. This was about reclaiming the symbol of a lifetime, about proving to myself, to my wife's memory, and even to my son, that I was not the weak, sentimental fool he believed me to be. He thought he had erased her from my life. But I would find that ring, and when I did, it would be the first step toward making him pay for what he had done. The search dragged into its second day. My body was weary, my feet sore from walking shop to shop, but I refused to stop. Each time I pushed open another pawnshop door, I carried the same picture in my mind, her hand slipping that ring onto mine, her smile trembling with joy. That memory kept me steady, even when disappointment threatened to crush me. By the afternoon, I found myself standing outside a jeweler's shop I had nearly passed by, its sign faded, its windows cluttered with dust-streaked displays. Something urged me inside. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of old wood polish. Behind the counter stood a middle-aged man with sharp eyes that flicked up when I entered. I walked slowly to the glass case and began my ritual once again, describing the ring in careful detail, a simple gold band, plain, my wife's initials etched inside. His expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the counter, pulling out a small tray of rings. My heart thudded as he placed them on the glass, and I scanned each one with desperate intensity. Then I saw it. At first glance, it looked like any other plain band, unremarkable, modest. But as I leaned closer, as my eyes focused on the inside of the band, I saw it the tiny letters carved by my wife's careful hand all those years ago. Her initials still clear despite the decades. The air left my lungs in a rush. My hands trembled as I reached for it, but I stopped myself, forcing my fingers to remain steady. I picked it up as gently as if it were made of glass. The metal was cool against my skin, but it burned with memory. I turned it over in my palm, my vision blurring as tears welled in my eyes. It was her. It was us. It was everything I thought I had lost forever. I swallowed hard and looked at the jeweler. His eyes darted away, his mouth tightening. He knew exactly how it had come into his possession. My voice was low, controlled, but steady. "Who brought this in?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "A young fellow, tall, dark hair, said he needed quick cash. Brought it in a few days ago. I gave him a fair price." Fair price. The words made me want to spit. How could anyone put a price on something priceless? But I didn't argue. I simply nodded, reaching into my pocket for the envelope of cash I had prepared before beginning my search. I placed it on the counter without a word. The man counted it, then slid the ring toward me with an almost guilty glance. I curled my hand around it instantly, my fist closing tight, as though afraid it might vanish again. Relief flooded through me, sharp and overwhelming, mingled with grief so deep it nearly broke me. I stepped outside into the cool air, my hand still clenched around the band, and for the first time in days, I felt the faintest trace of peace. I stood there on the sidewalk, my eyes closed, my hand pressed against my chest. The ring was back where it belonged, safe in my keeping. I whispered her name softly, as though she could hear me through the veil of time and death. "I found it," I said. "I brought you back." People passed me on the street, indifferent, but I didn't care. The world had shrunk to the weight of that small piece of gold in my hand. It was more than metal. It was memory restored, love rescued from the hands of betrayal. I slipped it back into my pocket, holding it there as though it were a heartbeat. But beneath the relief, anger still pulsed like a steady drum. My son had sold it without hesitation, had stripped me of my dignity and mocked my love for her. He had traded something eternal for a week's pleasure, and he believed he had gotten away with it. He didn't know that I had found it. He didn't know that his betrayal was no longer a secret. As I walked home, each step felt heavier, but steadier too. The ring was mine again. The memory was mine again. And now, with it safe in my possession, I could begin the next part of my plan. My son thought he had silenced me, that I was too weak to confront him, but soon he would learn the truth. The ring was more than proof of his betrayal. It was the spark that would ignite his reckoning. When I walked back into the house with the ring secure in my pocket, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and fury. The metal pressed against my palm like a secret only I knew, its weight reminding me that I had reclaimed what was stolen, but also that the thief was still living under my roof. Oblivious to the fact that his betrayal had been uncovered, I slipped quietly into my room, placed the ring back inside the little wooden box, and set it in its place. Only this time, I locked the box and slid it deep into the drawer. It was safe again, and this time I would guard it like a sentinel. The sound of laughter drifted through the hall, pulling me back to reality. My son and his wife were in the guest room preparing for their holiday. I moved silently down the corridor until I reached the door, slightly ajar. I stood there unseen and watched. Suitcases lay open on the bed, clothes spilling out in piles of bright colors, the kind of outfits chosen for photographs rather than practicality. His wife held up a new dress, twirling in front of the mirror, while my son stuffed items carelessly into his bag, grinning with smug satisfaction. "This trip is going to be perfect," his wife said, her voice high with excitement. "First-class flights, a beachfront hotel, and no worries for 2 whole weeks." He laughed, zipping up the suitcase with a flourish. "I told you, didn't I? Easy money." He didn't even notice. The old man is clueless, just living in his own little world. Honestly, I could take half the house, and he'd never see it coming. Her laughter joined his, light and cruel, echoing in my ears like a hammer striking an anvil. My jaw clenched, but I said nothing. I stood there in the shadow of the hallway, watching the boy I had raised reduce my life, my sacrifices, and my love to a joke. Inside, my fury burned hot, but outwardly, I remained calm. I stepped away from the door, careful not to make a sound, and walked back to the living room. I sat in my armchair, the same one where I had so often cradled my grief and forced myself into stillness. If they looked at me now, they would see nothing but an old man watching the evening news. They would never know that I held the truth in my pocket, that I had already taken the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. He thought he was untouchable. That much was clear in the way he carried himself, in the arrogance dripping from his every word. He believed I was blind, deaf, too weak to confront him. He saw my silence as proof of his superiority. That was his mistake. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the most dangerous weapon of all, the mask that hides intent, the cloak that shields the gathering storm. When they joined me later in the living room, their faces bright and giddy, I smiled faintly, as though nothing were wrong. My son talked excitedly about their itinerary, boasting of the resort, the sights they would see, the luxury they would indulge in. His wife chimed in, already planning the photos she would post, the envy she would provoke. I nodded, offered polite responses, never letting my eyes betray the truth. Every word he spoke felt like another nail driven into the coffin of the relationship we once had. But I endured it, quiet and steady, because I knew something he didn't. While he bragged about the life he thought he was stealing, I was already planning the reckoning he would face when he returned. That night, when the house grew quiet and I was alone again, I went to my room, opened the drawer, and took the ring in my hand. I held it tightly, feeling its cool weight against my skin, and whispered, "He thinks he has won, But he doesn't know. He has no idea what's coming. I slipped the ring back into the box and closed it, my heart steady, my resolve sharper than ever. My son believed himself untouchable, but soon he would learn just how wrong he was. His arrogance blinded him, and that blindness would be his undoing. For now, I would wear the mask of silence, but beneath it, every moment would be preparing for the strike he would never see coming. 2 days after they left for their holiday, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Their laughter was gone, the sound of their careless footsteps silenced, but the echoes of their betrayal remained. Each room carried the memory of their cruelty, the sharp sting of their voices mocking me. Yet in that silence, I also felt a strange freedom. With them gone, I could finally act without interference. I took the little wooden box from the drawer and opened it once more. The ring sat inside, gleaming faintly in the morning light. I held it in my hand and whispered to my wife, as if she were there beside me, "You always told me to stand firm when the time came. The time is here." Then I slipped the ring back into the box and closed it. My mind was set. That morning, I put on my suit. It wasn't new, but it was clean and pressed, the same one I had worn to her funeral. As I buttoned the jacket, I felt the weight of resolve settle over me like armor. Today was not about grief. Today was about justice. I took a bus into the city, sitting quietly among strangers, staring out the window as the streets passed by. I thought of all the years I had worked to build what little I had, the house, the savings, the few investments carefully tended over time. They were not much by the world's standards, but to me, they were everything. They were the fruits of my labor, the foundation of my wife's memory, the legacy I had once dreamed of leaving to my son. But that dream was dead now, destroyed by his own arrogance. When I stepped into the lawyer's office, I felt the shift immediately. The air smelled faintly of leather and old paper, the walls lined with books whose spines gleamed with gold letters. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and professional. She rose to greet me with a polite smile. "Mr. Alvarez," she said, extending her hand. "I'm glad you could come in today. Please, have a seat." I sat down, my hands folded in my lap, though inside they trembled with the gravity of what I was about to do. She opened a folder, her pen poised, ready to take notes. "You mentioned over the phone that you wanted to discuss changes to your will?" I nodded, my throat tightening for a moment before I found my voice. "Yes, it's time to make sure my affairs are in order, and it's time to make sure my son has no part in them." Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but she did not pry. Instead, she nodded briskly, professional and composed. "All right, then let's begin. Could you tell me exactly how you would like to restructure your estate?" So I told her. I described the house, the savings, the modest investments. I explained that once it had all been intended for him, the boy I had raised, the man who had failed me, but not anymore. With each word, my voice grew steadier, colder. "I want everything divided into 3 portions," I said. "The first will go to charity, a foundation that supports widows and children in my wife's name. The second will go to my granddaughter. She is innocent in all this, and she deserves a chance at a life built on more than greed. The third, I want placed into a scholarship fund. Something that will outlive me, something that will make sure others rise from the kind of struggles I once endured." The lawyer nodded, taking notes with precise strokes of her pen. "And your son?" she asked gently. "Nothing," I said, my voice like stone. "He gets nothing. He has already taken more from me than he will ever deserve. I want it written clearly, in unambiguous terms, so that when the time comes, there is no question. He is disinherited permanently." She looked at me then, perhaps expecting to see hesitation in my eyes, some flicker of regret. But there was none, only resolve. "Very well," she said. "We can make those changes. I'll prepare the documents for your signature." As she spoke, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This was not an act of vengeance alone. This was justice. This was me taking control of my legacy, of my wife's memory, of the story that would be told long after I was gone. My son thought he had taken everything from me when he sold that ring. But in truth, I still held the power to decide how the story ended. When I left the office that afternoon, the city air felt lighter. I walked slowly, my steps steady, the papers folded neatly in my briefcase. For the first time in years, I felt the burden of silence lift. My son thought I was weak, thought my quietness meant submission. But today proved otherwise. Today, I had taken the first step toward ensuring that his betrayal would cost him everything. The house was quiet when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the evening air. I glanced at the caller ID and saw his name flashing on the screen. My son, a week into his holiday, no doubt lounging on some beach, cocktail in hand, while I sat in the home built from my sacrifices. For a moment, I considered letting it ring out, but something inside me urged me to answer. This was an opportunity, a chance to measure his arrogance against my silence. I picked up the phone slowly, pressing it to my ear. His voice came bright, almost too cheerful. "Dad, how are you? We're having the best time here. The resort is amazing. The view is incredible. You wouldn't believe it." I let him talk, listening to his words spill out like a rehearsed performance. Every sentence was laced with smugness, with the self-satisfaction of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. I could picture him there, stretched out on a sunbed, his wife by his side, their glasses clinking as they toasted their cleverness. But after the pleasantries, his tone shifted, casual at first, then insistent. "Listen, Dad, there's just one small thing. We're running a little short. The resort had some unexpected charges and, well, you know how it is. If you could wire a little money over just to tide us through, I'd really appreciate it. Just a few hundred, nothing much." The audacity of it nearly made me laugh, but I held my tongue. Here he was, basking in luxury paid for by selling my wedding ring, calling me from paradise to ask for more. Once again he assumed I would fold, that I would sacrifice what little I had left just to keep him comfortable. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch long enough for him to notice. Then, in a calm, steady voice, I said, "No." There was a pause on the other end, a flicker of confusion in his tone when he spoke again. "What do you mean, no?" "Dad, come on, it's just a little help. You've always been there when I needed you. Don't make a big deal out of this." But my voice did not waver. I said, "No, you'll manage." The silence that followed was heavier this time. I could hear the faint hum of background noise, laughter and music in the distance, but my son didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Dad, are you serious? You know I need this. You can't just leave me hanging like this." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the ring in my pocket grounding me. I had no need to shout, no need to explain. My refusal was enough. For the first time, he was forced to hear the word he had never believed I could say. "You'll manage," I repeated, my tone final, unyielding. Then I ended the call before he could respond. For a long moment I sat in the silence that followed, the phone still in my hand. My heart was steady, my breathing calm. The power of that single word, "no," filled me with a quiet satisfaction. He had always assumed my love would override my boundaries, that my sacrifices were endless. But tonight, I had shown him the first crack in the illusion. Tonight, I had planted the seed of doubt. I imagined him staring at his phone in disbelief, turning to his wife with a frown, muttering about how the old man was acting strange. That doubt would gnaw at him, small at first but growing, until it undermined the smug certainty with which he had built his life. I slipped the phone onto the table and reached for the wooden box. Opening it, I took out the ring and held it tightly, pressing it against my chest. My wife's initials glinted faintly in the dim light, and I whispered to her. I said, no. Finally, the house around me was silent, but it was no longer suffocating. Tonight, the silence felt powerful, purposeful. For years, my son had mistaken it for weakness, but he was beginning to learn the truth. My silence was not surrender. It was the sound of a storm gathering, one that would soon break over his head with a force he could never have imagined. The day of their return arrived with the same heaviness as storm clouds gathering in the distance. I had counted down the days, not with eagerness, but with a grim anticipation, knowing that once he walked back through the door, the game of silence and revelation would truly begin. When I heard the sound of the front door opening, followed by the unmistakable echo of his voice, my heart tightened, but my face remained calm, composed, unreadable. "Dad, we're back," he called out, his tone bright and self-satisfied, as if he had just conquered the world. His wife trailed behind him, dragging a suitcase across the floor, her face flushed with the glow of sun and indulgence. They carried themselves with the careless swagger of people who believed they had beaten the system, who believed their arrogance would never meet consequence. I stepped out from the kitchen, wiping my hands on a dish towel, as though nothing had changed. "Welcome home," I said, my voice even, my expression mild. My son grinned, dropping his suitcase in the hallway with a thud. "You should have seen it, Dad. The beach was incredible. The food was unreal, and the hotel 5 stars, the works. You'd have loved it." I nodded, letting him ramble, my eyes watching every gesture, every smirk. He had no idea that while he basked in the sun, sipping cocktails and boasting of his cleverness, I had reclaimed the ring he thought was gone forever. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. His wife chimed in, her voice dripping with pride. "It was the trip of a lifetime. Honestly, we're already talking about going back next year. You can't put a price on experiences like that." I nearly laughed at the irony of her words. A price had been paid. It had been paid with the most sacred symbol of my life, with the love and memory of the woman who once wore that ring. And yet here they were, parading their arrogance before me as if nothing had happened, as if I were too blind, too weak to see. He collapsed onto the couch, stretching his arms wide with a dramatic sigh of satisfaction. "I needed this so badly, Dad. I feel like a new man. Sometimes you just have to live a little, you know. You can't spend your whole life clinging to the past." It's, his words were meant to sting, I knew that. A pointed jab at the sentiment he mocked, the love and memory I refused to let go of. But I kept my face still, my tone neutral. "I'm glad you enjoyed yourself," I said softly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, grinning like a man who believed he had fooled the world. "You should have come with us. But then again, you're too stubborn for that, aren't you? Always stuck in your ways." I met his gaze briefly, just long enough for him to see nothing in my eyes. No anger, no reaction, just silence. He shifted slightly, perhaps unsettled by it, but quickly recovered, launching back into stories of the trip, the excursions, the meals, the parties. Each tale was told with exaggerated flair, as though he were the star of some grand adventure. I listened, nodding occasionally, offering the smallest responses, while inside me, my resolve only grew colder. He thought nothing had changed. He thought I was the same silent father who would swallow his arrogance, who would endure his mockery. But he was wrong. Behind my calm exterior, the storm was already building. Later, when the suitcases were shoved into corners and the stories were exhausted, he stretched again and said casually, "Anyway, thanks for everything, Dad. I know I can always count on you." I turned away before he could see the flicker of steel in my eyes. He thought he could always count on me, that I would forever be the foundation he could stand on while tearing me down. But what he didn't know was that the foundation had already shifted, and soon it would crumble beneath him. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I opened the wooden box and held the ring once more. The cool gold pressed against my skin, grounding me, reminding me of why I was doing this. He had returned from his holiday untouched, smug, arrogant, acting as if nothing had happened. But he would not leave untouched from what was to come. His return was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of his fall. The evening of the confrontation came sooner than even I expected. He had been home only a few days, and already his arrogance had returned to its full strength, filling every room like a stench I could not escape. He moved around the house as if he owned it, dropping his shoes in the hallway, leaving half-finished drinks on the counter, barking little demands at me as if I were a servant rather than the man who had given him everything. I endured it all with silence, because I knew what was coming. That night, I asked him to sit down with me at the dining table. He smirked, raising an eyebrow as though it amused him that I would summon him like a boy again. But he humored me, sliding into a chair with a careless grin, his arms crossed over his chest. His wife hovered in the background, curious but uninterested, as though she already knew the script of my weakness. The table between us was bare, except for one small wooden box. I rested my hand on it, my fingers lightly brushing the lid. For a long moment, I said nothing, simply letting the silence stretch. He shifted slightly, impatience flickering across his face. Finally, I opened the box and drew out the ring. The gold caught the light of the lamp above us, gleaming softly, a quiet yet undeniable presence. I placed it carefully on the table between us, the sound of metal against wood sharp and final. His eyes flickered downward, and in that instant, the smirk faltered. "Do you know," I asked slowly, my voice calm and steady, "how I got this back?" The question hung in the air like a blade. His face tightened, the arrogance slipping into something else, confusion, then unease. He leaned forward, his eyes darting to mine, then back to the ring. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. I didn't blink. "You sold it, my wedding ring. You sold it for a holiday. You thought it was gone forever. But here it is, back in my hands." His wife shifted in the background, her expression faltering. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came. The silence stretched again, thicker now, heavy with the weight of the truth pressing down on him. "You laughed about it," I continued, my voice low but sharp. I heard you mocking me, mocking your mother's memory, calling me weak. Do you remember those words?" His jaw worked as though he were chewing glass, his eyes darting desperately for an escape. "Dad, do not lie to me," I interrupted, my tone suddenly hard, final. The sound of my voice startled even me, echoing through the room with a power I had not used in years. He froze, his mouth snapping shut, his bravado collapsing under the weight of my command. I leaned forward, my hands on the table, my eyes locked on his. For decades, I gave you everything. I sacrificed until I had nothing left to give. And this is how you repay me? By selling the last piece of the woman who raised you, who loved you more than life itself, for a week in the sun? The color drained from his face. His wife lowered her gaze, suddenly unwilling to meet mine. The silence that followed was no longer one of arrogance, but of fear. He knew he had been caught, exposed, stripped bare of the lies he had wrapped himself in. I tapped the ring with one finger, the sound sharp in the still air. This ring survived everything, hardship, loss, death itself. And you tried to erase it for your pleasure, but you failed. And now you will face what comes next. His voice cracked as he finally tried to speak. Dad, I didn't mean... But I cut him off again, my voice cold and immovable. You meant every word, and now you will learn that my silence was not weakness, it was patience. Patience for this moment. The ring sat between us, a symbol no longer of love alone, but of justice. He stared at it, then at me, his mask of entitlement shattered. For the first time in years, I saw something new in his eyes, fear. For a long moment after my words, silence clung to the air like smoke. My son stared at the ring as if it were some cursed object, his lips parting, but no sound escaping. The cocky grin, the air of superiority that had clung to him since the day he walked back through my door, was gone. In its place was something raw, thinner, more fragile. Fear. He shifted in his chair, his shoulders stiff, his hands twisting together nervously on the table. Finally, his voice broke through the quiet, hoarse and unsteady. Dad, it's not what you think. I didn't mean anything by it. I needed some quick money, that's all. It was just a ring. I thought you wouldn't notice. The words fell from his mouth in fragments, rushed, desperate, a flimsy attempt to patch together the arrogance that had once seemed unshakable. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on him, offering him no comfort, no reprieve. He shifted again, his panic growing under the weight of my silence. I was going to buy it back, he blurted suddenly, his eyes darting to the side as if searching for validation from his wife, who now stood frozen behind him. Yeah, that's right. I was going to buy it back after the trip. I didn't have time. You know how it is, Dad. Things happen. You wouldn't understand. His excuses tumbled out one after another, flimsy shields against the truth pressing down on him. His voice rose slightly, sharp and defensive, as though volume could disguise the weakness in his words. Come on, Dad, don't look at me like that. It wasn't that big of a deal. You've still got it now, don't you? No harm done. No harm done. The phrase made my chest tighten with a fury so cold it almost felt calm. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands together, and let the silence stretch again. He squirmed under it, sweat gathering at his brow, his fingers drumming nervously against the table. He tried again, his words now tumbling faster, less coherent. I just wanted to give her something nice, he said, jerking his thumb toward his wife, who flinched at the sudden attention. She deserved a holiday. We both did. And you've always had everything locked away, never using it, just letting it sit there. What's the point of holding on to something if it just gathers dust? I thought you wouldn't care. His words wavered at the end, breaking apart under their own weight. For the first time in years, I saw the boy beneath the arrogance, insecure, desperate, scrambling to justify the unjustifiable. His voice cracked as he tried again. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Dad. I didn't mean to make you upset. I thought it would be fine." I let the silence linger until his eyes filled with something he had never shown me before: shame. His arrogance was crumbling, piece by piece, every excuse he offered falling flat against the unmovable wall of truth. "You thought I wouldn't notice?" I finally said, my voice low and measured. "You thought I wouldn't notice the absence of the one thing that tied me to your mother? You thought it was fine to sell it for cocktails and sand, to laugh at me while you mocked everything I ever stood for?" His lips trembled, his face pale. "Dad, He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "I made a mistake. That's all. Just a mistake." But I shook my head slowly. "A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. A mistake is misplacing your keys. What you did was a choice, a deliberate choice to betray me, to betray her. And now you want to stand here and pretend it was nothing?" He buried his face in his hands, groaning softly, his body folding inward as though the truth had finally broken through the armor he had wrapped around himself for so long. His arrogance was gone. In its place was panic, naked and desperate. The room felt heavier with every passing second, the weight of his shame pressing down until even his wife lowered her eyes, unwilling to look at me or him. The excuses had failed. The arrogance had shattered. My son, the man who once believed himself untouchable, was now nothing more than a frightened child, scrambling in vain to undo what could never be undone. The silence after his stammering excuses was thick enough to choke on. He sat slumped in his chair, his hands covering his face, his wife shifting nervously behind him, her eyes darting between us as if she were trapped in a storm she could not escape. I let the quiet stretch until it became unbearable. Then, with deliberate calm, I reached for the leather folder I had placed on the sideboard earlier that day. The sound of it sliding across the table made him look up, his eyes red and desperate. I opened it slowly, pulling out a neat stack of papers, their crisp edges gleaming under the light. I set them carefully in front of him, my hand steady, my face unreadable. "Do you know what these are?" I asked, my tone quiet but firm. He blinked, confused, his brow furrowing as he glanced down at the pages. His lips parted as he read the bold heading at the top, "Last Will and Testament." His eyes widened. "Dad, what is this?" I folded my hands, leaning back slightly, watching him without flinching. "That is the future, son. Or rather, it was supposed to be. That document once held your name. It once promised you the house you live in, the savings you've drained, the security I worked my whole life to build. But not anymore." His fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages, his voice cracking as he stammered, "What do you mean? My name's not. Where am I?" "You're nowhere," I said, my voice as cold as the steel of a blade. "I went to a lawyer. I had everything changed. My estate will go to causes that matter, to those who understand sacrifice, to those who will honor your mother's memory instead of mocking it. And to you?" I let the silence stretch before finishing. "You will get nothing. Not one penny, not one brick of this house. Nothing." The words landed like hammer blows. His face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. His wife's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in shock. He slammed his palm against the table, his voice rising into a shaky roar. "You can't do this. I'm your son. You don't just cut your own son out of your will. That's insane." I did not flinch. "I can, and I did. Because being my son is not a title you can wear like a crown. It is a bond forged by love, respect, and loyalty. And you broke it. You shattered it the moment you sold that ring." His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands shaking as he shoved the papers back toward me. "This is ridiculous. You're bluffing. You'd never actually do this to me." I met his eyes, steady and unyielding. "I already have." The certainty in my voice struck him harder than any shouted words ever could. He froze, his chest heaving, his arrogance collapsing into disbelief. His wife lowered her gaze, her silence confirming the truth he didn't want to accept. I slid the folder back toward me, tucking the papers neatly inside. My movements were calm, precise, deliberate, in stark contrast to his frantic panic. "You thought you could strip me of everything that mattered and face no consequence. You thought my silence was weakness. But this," I tapped the folder, "this is proof that my silence was simply waiting for the right moment." He leaned back in his chair, his face pale, his hands clawing at his hair, as though he could physically tear apart the reality pressing in around him. "Dad, please," he said finally, his voice breaking into a pleading whimper. "Don't do this. I messed up, I know, but I'm still your son. You can't just erase me." I looked at him, my eyes hard, my heart steady. "You erased yourself when you chose greed over love, when you chose arrogance over respect, when you sold the last piece of your mother for a holiday." His head dropped into his hands, his body shaking with despair. The silence that followed was not the silence of arrogance anymore. It was the silence of defeat, of a man realizing that the future he had always counted on had been stripped away, leaving him with nothing but the weight of his own betrayal. The room was suffocating with silence, the kind that presses down on every breath, making even the smallest sound echo like thunder. My son sat across from me, his head buried in his hands, the papers I had shown him still lying on the table like a verdict carved in stone. His wife shifted nervously in her seat, her eyes darting between us but offering no defense, no words of comfort. It was as though even she understood the weight of what had just been revealed. I sat upright, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my face calm and unreadable. Inside, there was no rage left, no trembling grief. What remained was something colder, sharper, the steel of resolve. He had begged, he had pleaded, he had thrown excuses like stones at a wall that would not crack. Now it was time for the final truth. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes bloodshot, his expression a mask of desperation. "Dad," he croaked, his voice unsteady, "please, don't do this. I'm your son. I made a mistake, that's all. You can't just throw me away like this. You've always been there for me, always. Don't let this one thing erase everything we've been through." I studied him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until his words withered under it. Then I leaned forward slightly, my gaze locking on his, my voice low but unyielding. "Do you know what you did, son? Do you really understand it?" He blinked rapidly, his lips trembling, but no answer came. His silence was all the permission I needed. I reached for the ring where it sat on the table, lifted it between two fingers, and held it up to the light. It gleamed faintly, the initials carved inside catching the glow, a reminder of the love it had once represented. "You traded this," I said softly, my voice carrying more weight than a shout ever could, "for a holiday. You traded your father's love, your mother's memory, a lifetime of sacrifice, for a week in the sun." He flinched as though the words themselves were a blow. I set the ring down carefully, the sound of metal against wood cutting through the silence like a knife. My eyes never left his. "That's all your inheritance was worth. 7 days of cocktails and beaches, 7 days of empty laughter bought at the cost of everything sacred." His mouth opened as though to protest, but no sound came. His wife turned away, her hands clasped tightly together, shame etched across her face. He sagged back in his chair, his chest heaving, his face pale. "You thought my silence meant weakness," I continued, my tone cold and precise. "But silence has power. It has patience. And now you sit here with nothing, because you chose to value pleasure over legacy, arrogance over respect, greed over love, and in that choice you destroyed everything I ever wanted to give you." His lips trembled, his voice cracking into a hoarse whisper. "Dad, please, I didn't know." I shook my head slowly, my eyes narrowing. "You knew enough. You knew that ring mattered. You knew what it represented, and still you mocked me. Still you sold it. You didn't care then, and now you must face the price." Tears welled in his eyes, spilling down his cheeks, but I felt no pity. Pity had died the moment I heard him laugh about my pain, the moment I heard him call me weak. What filled me now was clarity. For the first time in decades, I felt no confusion about where I stood. I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest. "So remember this. When you think of inheritance, when you think of legacy, when you think of all that could have been yours, remember that you traded it. Not for years of comfort, not for a lifetime of stability, but for a single week in the sun." His body sagged, broken, his arrogance shattered beyond repair. The truth had landed with finality, and there was no escaping it. He buried his face in his hands again, sobbing quietly, while I sat in silence, steady and resolute. The final blow had been delivered, and with it, the chapter of his entitlement, his greed, and his arrogance was closed forever. The night stretched long after his sobs faded into silence. He sat hunched at the table, broken and small, his wife standing stiffly beside him, her eyes lowered, her hands wringing together nervously. The weight of what I had said hung heavy in the air, an immovable truth neither of them could escape. I let the quiet linger, not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. There was nothing more to add. The final blow had already been struck, and the consequences would echo far beyond this night. I reached across the table and took the ring into my hand once more. The gold felt cool against my skin, its familiar weight both steadying and profound. I turned it slowly between my fingers, tracing the tiny initials inside, the letters carved by my wife's hand so many decades ago. That ring had endured years of hardship, had survived grief and death, had been stolen and sold, and yet here it was, returned to me. It had come full circle, battered by betrayal but never truly lost, just like me. With deliberate care, I slipped it back onto my finger. The fit was as natural as breathing, as though it had been waiting all this time to return home. I closed my eyes briefly, and in that moment I could almost feel her hand in mine again, warm and gentle, steadying me the way she always had. A quiet calm spread through me, a peace I hadn't felt since the day I first discovered the box empty. Justice had been served. Not the loud kind of justice that shouts and demands the world's attention, but the quiet, unshakable kind that restores dignity and balance. My son had thought he could strip me of everything sacred, but he had learned that some things cannot be stolen, cannot be sold, cannot be erased. Love, sacrifice, memory, they endure, even in the face of betrayal. I opened my eyes and looked across the table at him. He avoided my gaze, his body trembling, his face pale and streaked with tears. For years he had seen me as nothing more than a resource, a well to drain dry, a silent man too weak to fight back. But tonight he had seen the truth. Tonight he had seen that my silence was not weakness. It was strength waiting for its moment. I pushed back my chair and stood, my movements slow but steady. "This is the end," I said quietly, my voice even. "There is nothing more to discuss. You made your choice and I made mine. My dignity remains. Your mother's memory remains. You cannot take that from me." He looked up then, his eyes hollow, his lips parting as though to beg again. But I raised my hand, stopping him before the words could leave his mouth. "Enough. Leave me in peace." The weight of my words left no room for argument. He rose slowly from the chair, his shoulders slumped, his arrogance gone. His wife followed silently, her eyes never meeting mine. Together they left the dining room, their footsteps retreating into the hallway, leaving me alone once more. I sank back into my chair, my hand resting on the ring, my heart steady. The house was silent, but it was no longer the silence of grief or humiliation. It was the silence of triumph, the silence of a man who had reclaimed his dignity, who had defended the memory of the woman he loved, who had proven that betrayal could wound but never destroy. I looked toward the small photograph on the sideboard, the one of my wife smiling in the garden so many years ago. I whispered softly, "It's done. He can't touch us anymore." The ring gleamed faintly under the light, catching the shadows and scattering them like shards of broken glass. I felt no joy, no celebration, only peace, the deep, steady peace of knowing that justice had been carried out, that the legacy of love remained untarnished, that my silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. And as I sat there, the cool metal snug around my finger, I knew with absolute certainty I had lost much in this life. But I had not lost myself. My dignity remained. Her memory remained. And that was more than enough. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.